He was supposed to die before anyone remembered his name. By the third bullet, his men were already shouting for a medic. By the fourth, they were certain they were watching their sergeant's last seconds on Earth. By the sixth, even the enemy thought he was finished, just another broken body on a ruined French road. What none of them knew was that the man lying in the mud, barely able to breathe, was still doing math in his head. Distances, timings, artillery grids. He wasn't thinking about his wounds. He was thinking about the 400 exhausted soldiers and wounded men still trying to escape down the only road behind him. At 8:29 a.m., bleeding from 6 separate gunshot wounds, Staff Sergeant William, or Will Harper, picked up a radio with shaking hands and made a decision every sane officer had told him never to make. Seconds later, more than 100 enemy soldiers who thought they were about to overrun a broken line suddenly stopped dead in their tracks, not because someone fired a hero's last bullet, but because of a cold, calculated final move from a man everyone thought was already dead.
It was February 18th, 1944. Somewhere on the Western Front, on a map stained with coffee and mud, there was a tiny black dot that didn't even have a name printed next to it. To headquarters, it was just objective, village and bridge. To the men on the ground, it was the only thing standing between order and disaster. The village itself was nothing special. A stone church with a crooked bell tower, a handful of houses leaning into the wind, a schoolhouse with broken windows and a playground no child had used in years, and behind it all, a narrow bridge over a shallow, muddy creek that you could almost jump across on foot. Almost. On a quiet day, you could have walked through that village in 3 minutes and never thought about it again. But on that morning, every road for miles squeezed down into that single bridge. Every retreating truck, every ambulance full of wounded men, every jeep carrying officers and maps and orders had to pass over that thin strip of wood and stone. The situation behind the lines was worse than the reports admitted. The Allied push in that sector had stalled, then bent, then started to fold back on itself. Units were pulling out under pressure, not in neat columns, but in ragged streams. Artillery batteries were limping backward with half their guns. Medics were cramming twice as many wounded as they should into every vehicle that would still start. If the enemy broke through at that village, if they seized that bridge before the retreat finished, they wouldn't just win a skirmish, they would slam a door on an entire section of the front. 400 men, tired, hungry, already halfway broken, would find themselves stuck in open fields, on roads with no cover, within reach of enemy mortars and machine guns. There would be no orderly withdrawal, no second defensive line, just a slaughter. That was the context behind the simple order that landed on one desk the night before. Company E will delay enemy forces at village crossroads until 0900 hours. Delay. Such a small, polite word. Company E was down to 93 effective men. They had been fighting, marching, and digging for weeks. Boots were worn thin. Bandages peeked from under sleeves and collars. Their machine gun teams had fewer belts than they needed. Their engineers had exactly enough explosives for one good surprise and a few desperate last resort tricks. Over them all stood Staff Sergeant William "Will" Harper. He was not the highest-ranking man in the sector, not the most famous, not a legend, not yet. Just a career NCO who had been in uniform long enough to stop believing in clean victories and neat endings. He knew the real weight of that order. It did not say, "Hold if possible." It did not say, "Withdraw if enemy strength is superior." It said, "Until 0900, and everyone understood what that meant. They were to trade minutes of their lives for miles of safe road behind them. If necessary, all of their lives. Harper walked the length of the village in the dark before dawn, checking each position himself. He stopped in doorways and upstairs rooms, tapping shoulders, adjusting firing angles by inches. He spoke quietly, not like a man making a speech, but like someone tightening the last bolts on a machine he knew would be pushed to its breaking point. He knew each man's face. He knew who aimed high when they were nervous, who needed a word, who needed silence. He also knew he couldn't promise any of them that they would see 901. Behind the last house, the road dipped slightly and then rose toward the bridge. Beyond that bridge, under low clouds and drifting smoke, Harper could see the faint glint of metal. Convoys already moving, already trusting. Those men didn't know his name. They would never know who was buying them time with sandbags, broken walls, and fragile human bodies. But Harper knew one thing with complete clarity as he settled into the ruined farmhouse that would serve as his command post. If that thin line of stone and timber, called a village, failed to hold for the next few hours, there would be no heroic counterattack, no clever maneuver to fix the mistake. There would only be headlines later about a local collapse and heavy casualties during withdrawal. And somewhere between those cold words and the truth would be the story of what 93 men did when the only thing the Army asked of them was to stand in the way until time ran out.
At 0611, the village stopped being a place on a map and became a shooting gallery. Harper saw them first as tiny shapes on the far ridge, 4 dark figures breaking away from the tree line, moving with the careful, economical motions of men who had done this 100 times before. Scouts. They moved in a loose diamond, one slightly ahead, one trailing, all of them stopping every few steps to raise binoculars or scopes toward the village. Harper watched them through his own glasses from the shattered window of the farmhouse. He could feel his men behind him, a quiet pressure in the cramped room, boots scuffing the floor, someone's breath just a little too fast. He lowered the binoculars and checked his watch. 6:11. He did a calculation in his head, one he'd done on other mornings in other broken places. How long would it take for those scouts to report what they saw, for officers to confer, for mortars to be repositioned, for a first assault wave to be assembled? He came up as an answer he didn't like, because it meant his little company had less time than his men probably believed. Behind him, down the slight slope, the road was already alive. Trucks rattled past, springs groaning under the weight of men, crates, and bandaged limbs. Some of the wounded stared out the slats at the village as they passed, faces pale and exhausted, eyes unfocused. None of them knew they were looking at the last thin barrier between themselves and an enemy infantry eager to carve into their backs. Harper turned back to the window. The scouts had stopped just short of the fields, finding cover behind a low rise and a clump of trees. One of them pointed. Another raised a radio to his mouth. "Right on schedule," Harper muttered. He moved away from the window and stepped into the hallway, his boots crunching on shattered plaster. He leaned over the stairwell. Below, in what used to be a sitting room, a machine gun team waited behind a loophole they'd knocked into the wall with a sledgehammer. "How's your field of fire?" Harper asked. "Like you said, Sarge, straight down the throat." "Good," Harper replied. "Remember, no one touches that trigger until you see my hand drop. We don't scare them off, we bring them in." He moved from position to position like that, a quiet presence in half-lit rooms and cellar corners, a pair of riflemen cramped together behind an upstairs window, a grenadier with 3 carefully laid out explosives and instructions for exactly how close to let the enemy come,
An engineer lying on his stomach in a dugout void beneath the road, listening to the faint grind of passing wheels through the earth above his head. Each time, Harper said very little. He didn't tell them to be brave, didn't promise reinforcements that would never arrive. He just checked angles, nudged barrels a few inches left or right, and reminded them of distances. First wrecked cart is at 35 yards. The second is at 58. Don't guess, count. By 06:24, the scouts had finished their work. Harper saw them melt back into the tree line and a different kind of movement take their place. This time it wasn't 4 cautious figures. It was 2 full sections, almost 50 men, fanning out as they came over the ridge and down toward the road. They moved in staggered columns, weapons at their sides, helmets bobbing rhythmically. They didn't look careless, just confident. From their perspective, this was probably another abandoned village, another empty shell to clear on their way to where the real fighting would happen. They scanned windows, but saw only dark glass and broken frames. They studied doorways, but no figures darted from building to building. The road ahead was quiet, lined with dead vehicles and farm wagons pulled into makeshift barricades. It looked like the aftermath of a fight, not the prelude to one. Harper stayed perfectly still behind his window. He could feel the tension building in his men as the enemy closed the distance. 70 yards. He knew because he had measured it in the night and paced it 3 times in the morning twilight. He let them keep coming. 60 yards. He heard someone's breath hitch behind him. He didn't turn. If he looked at them now, some part of him might flinch and give the order too early. 50 yards. He could see their faces now, strips of skin between scarves and helmet rims. He could make out the officer in front, head turning as he scanned the houses, right hand raised to give a signal that hadn't yet come. 40 yards. Harper stepped forward so his silhouette would be visible in the upper window of the farmhouse. Every rifle muzzle in his own company tracked that movement. He raised his right hand slowly, palm open, fingers spread. For a heartbeat, even the village seemed to hold its breath. The enemy kept moving, unaware that they had just walked into the exact center of a carefully measured killing zone. Then Harper dropped his hand. The effect was instant. The 2 machine guns in the sitting room below him vomited fire down the road, tracers stitching a red line from the barricades to the front ranks of the column. Rifles erupted from windows and doorways. Grenades arced out in lazy, terrifying curves, bouncing once or twice before detonating. The calm, methodical advance turned into chaos in less than 3 seconds. Men went down in mid-step, legs folding suddenly under them. Others dropped flat, scrambling for ditches that offered almost no cover from bullets coming in from 3 angles at once. Harper didn't cheer, didn't shout. He just watched the line break, eyes already searching for the ones who were still moving with purpose. Those were the ones who would cause trouble later. Then he gave the next signal, a small circular motion with 2 fingers barely visible in the smoke. In the ditch to the right, buried charges answered. The earth itself tore open under the survivors, throwing mud, splinters, and bodies into the air. The ditch that seemed like salvation became a trap filled with shrapnel and broken limbs. When the dust settled, there were no more organized ranks on the road. Just isolated figures crawling, some dragging wounded comrades, all of them desperate to get out of the crossfire. The first attack had lasted just over a minute. The men in Company E felt the adrenaline crash hit them like a second explosion. Hands shook as they reloaded. Someone realized they'd emptied an entire clip without remembering a single trigger pull. Harper let them have 10 seconds to breathe, then his voice cut through the ringing in their ears. Check ammo, check fields of fire. They're not done. That was them knocking on the door. He was right. Less than 40 minutes later, the sky itself began to fall. At 07:02, the first mortar rounds whistled in, long drawn-out sounds that made the hair on the back of every neck stand up just before impact. The first salvo landed short, throwing dirt into the road. The second creeped closer, chipping stone from the barricades and punching new holes into already wounded walls. The third salvo found the farmhouse. The blast lifted Harper off his feet and slammed him into a wall. Glass and brick dust filled the air. Somewhere a man was screaming for a mother who was not there. For a few long seconds, the village was nothing but noise, smoke, and the taste of grit on every tongue. Then, through the ringing, Harper's voice again. "Positions! If you can move, you can fight. This is just the warm-up." The first wave had tested their aim. The mortars were testing their nerve. The real fight was only beginning. By the time the first wave had been broken and the mortars had walked their way across the village, the enemy had learned two things about Company E. They were dug in deep, and they weren't going to run just because someone shouted at them in German. So the enemy changed tactics. They stopped trying to crush the roadblock in one straight punch down the center. Instead, they started reaching around it. The second serious attempt didn't come with marching columns and shouted orders. It came in the quiet gaps between the explosions. At 07:19, while the last echoes of a mortar salvo were still bouncing off the church bell, Harper saw movement where there shouldn't have been any, not on the road, but along the edges of the frozen fields. Small groups, 5 or 6 men at a time, slipping between hedgerows and low stone fences, using every fold in the ground to creep toward the village from both sides. If they got around the roadblock and into the houses, the whole defense would collapse from the inside out. Harper could have stayed in the farmhouse, stayed where the maps and the radio were. He didn't. He grabbed his rifle, checked the magazine by touch, and called for a 3-man fire team. "Left flank," he said. "Stone wall by the old orchard. We lose that, we lose the road." They moved at a crouch through the back alleys, feet slipping on broken tiles and wet mud, climbing over a knockdown fence to reach a low wall that bordered a narrow field. Beyond that wall, gray shapes moved between bare trees. Enemy infantry advancing in broken lines, heads low, rifles ready. Harper pressed his back to the stone and counted under his breath, listening to the rhythm of the explosions behind him. The mortars were still walking forward, still searching for the roadblock. The noise masked small sounds, boots on frozen furrows, metal on stone, the soft, nervous cough of a man who'd breathed too much smoke. He raised 3 fingers to the men beside him. 3, 2, 1. They popped up as one, rifles snapping to their shoulders. The range was close enough that there was no need to estimate. Harper's first shot broke the lead soldier's stride mid-step. The second and third shots from his men picked off 2 more. The enemy responded instantly. They dropped, rolled, and fired back. Short, controlled bursts that snapped over the wall and smacked into the farmhouse behind them. Harper's team ducked back down. Dust drifted down from the lip of the wall, shaken loose by bullet impacts. "Short bursts, not panic fire," Harper said between breaths. "Make them think there's more of us than there is." They rose again, fired again, then dropped as another burst of rounds chewed pieces out of the stone inches above their heads. The third time Harper lifted his rifle, he leaned just a fraction too far. The enemy gunner on the other side had been waiting for that. A submachine gun spat a short, vicious line of fire across the top of the wall. 3 bullets hit Harper almost as a single impact, one punching into his upper chest, one slamming into the meat of his shoulder, one tearing across his ribs as it ricocheted off the stone. The force of it picked him up and threw him backward. For a moment there was no village, no bridge, no men depending on him. There was only the sky, gray and distant above him, and a roaring in his ears like he was underwater. He tried to breathe and got nothing. His body refused to listen. Pain was there, somewhere at the edges of his awareness, but the first sensation was emptiness. Lungs that wouldn't fill, fingers that wouldn't move. The medic reached him first, sliding to his knees so fast he skinned them on broken stone. "Stay down, Sarge, stay down, you're hit bad." Harper blinked. His vision came back in pieces. The outline of the wall, the steam of his own breath in the cold air, the medic's hands fumbling at his jacket, searching for the biggest hole. Sound returned next, not as a full picture, but as fragments. Shouts, gunshots, the slap of bullets hitting the wall above. Someone yelling for more ammunition. His chest suddenly spasmed, dragging in a ragged breath that felt like it was lined with glass. He coughed, saw flecks of red on his sleeve, and understood that he wasn't dead, not yet. "Don't move," the medic insisted, already reaching for a morphine syringe. "You took 3 in the chest. You're done. We've got to evac you back to—" Harper grabbed his wrist. The group wasn't strong, but it was steady. "Save it," he rasped. The medic stared at him. "You don't understand, Sarge. "I understand exactly," Harper cut him off, each word costing him more breath than he could spare. "If I go back, who takes the left? You?" The medic didn't answer. Harper forced himself to look down at his own torso. The bullets had torn through fabric and skin, leaving bloody grooves and one ugly spreading stain, but the angle and the thickness of his gear had turned what should have been fatal hits into deep, savage grazing wounds. He could feel the hot, sick throb with every heartbeat, but he could move his fingers. He could breathe, even if it came in shallow, burning pulls. He was hurt, badly. He was not dead. And as long as that was true, he still considered himself on duty. "Pack it," he told the medic. "Dress what you can see. I still need the arm." The medic hesitated only a second, then shoved the morphine back into his kit and went to work with gauze and bandages, hands moving on instinct, even as his mind rebelled at what he was doing. While he worked, he listened. He listened to the pattern of incoming fire, to where the rounds were hitting the wall, to how close the enemy had crawled in the time he had been down. The gunfire edged closer. A grenade exploded somewhere to their right, showering them with dirt. "On your feet, Sarge, this is insane." Harper rolled to his side, biting down on a groan as his chest lit up with pain, and used the wall to drag himself upright. The world tilted, then steadied. He took his rifle back, feeling how much heavier it seemed now. That was hits 1, 2, and 3. The day wasn't done with him yet. When they fell back from the orchard toward the main line, shrapnel from a near mortar strike tore into the side of his neck and collarbone. It felt like someone had jammed a red-hot crowbar just under his skin. Warmth spread down the inside of his jacket. Hit number 4. Later, as he dragged an ammunition crate up a staircase to resupply a machine gun team that was almost dry, a sniper round punched through the wall and into his thigh. His leg buckled like it didn't belong to him. He went down hard on the steps, teeth clacking together. Hit number 5. He tied a tourniquet himself, hands shaking but methodical, and kept going up the stairs on one good leg and pure stubbornness. At some point after that, he could never say exactly when, a stray round smashed into his left forearm, grazing bone, turning his sleeve into a wet, sticky mess. Hit number 6. By any reasonable metric, Harper should have been lying on a stretcher by then, or on a table under a surgeon's hands, or under a blanket with his eyes closed forever. Instead, he found himself back in the same ruined farmhouse, leaning over the same map, breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Every heartbeat sent a fresh flare of pain through his chest and leg. His left arm shook when he tried to use it. His vision tunneled unexpectedly at times, edges going dark for a second before snapping back. He gripped the edge of the table until the wood creaked. Behind those numbers and pencil lines on the map, he saw trucks. He saw men hunched in the backs of them, too tired to hold their rifles upright,
too numb to realize how close they had come to never leaving that valley. He saw the road, the bridge, and the mass of enemy soldiers forming up in the woods for the final push. He took one slow breath, boxed the pain up, and put it somewhere in the back of his mind. 6 bullets had tried to end his war. All they had really done was strip away anything that wasn't essential. He had one job left: hold, delay, buy time with whatever he had left of himself. And for that, being half broken was still enough.
By 0812, the defense wasn't a neat line anymore. It was a collection of bleeding men, shattered walls, and stubborn decisions held together by habit, anger, and whatever was left of their strength. The village looked, from a distance, like it was already dead. One machine gun had jammed and stayed jammed. Another had burned through its last belt and was waiting on resupply that might never come. Several firing positions that had spat fire an hour earlier were now just holes in the walls with no one left behind them. Ammo counters came back with ugly numbers. Some riflemen were down to half a magazine. Grenades were reduced to whatever you've still got on your belt. The engineers, who had begun the morning with a careful inventory of explosives, were now shrugging and saying things like, "That's it, we're down to wire and bad language." And out there in the trees to the west, the enemy was getting ready. Scouts reported what Harper already suspected from the change in sound. No more probing attacks, no more small flanking parties. Instead, there was the low, constant murmur of officers shouting, of boots moving in organized formation, of something large gathering itself behind the tree line. At least 100 enemy soldiers, maybe more, were forming up for a final assault. They had seen the damage their mortars had done. They had watched the farmhouse take a hit, spotted machine gun positions fall silent, counted the gaps in the Allied fire. From their side, this must have looked like a tired, cracked defense that just needed one good shove to break completely. Harper stood hunched over the map table, one hand braced on the wood, the other pressed hard against his ribs beneath the edge of his jacket. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandages hours ago. Every time he inhaled, it felt like someone was dragging a nail along his chest. His leg throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a dull, insistent reminder that he was moving on borrowed minutes. He let his gaze run down the penciled lines and coordinates again. The road marked with a thick, dark line. The bridge, a small rectangle with a circle around it. The village, a rough square. Arrows showing where the enemy had already come from. Arrows showing where his own trucks were supposedly by now. And then there was one tiny, unobtrusive notation in the margin near his own position, a set of grid numbers with a single word next to them: danger. That note had been added late the previous night after a tense conversation with the artillery liaison officer. They had sat in that same room with a candle stub on the table, trading numbers like gamblers trading cards. "We can pre-register a fire mission on your location," the artillery officer had said, tapping the grid with a pencil. "We drop everything we have on this square. You understand what that means?" Harper understood too well. He had seen what a full battery could do to a hilltop, to a trench line, to a copse of trees unlucky enough to be in the wrong place. There wasn't much left afterward that you could recognize. "Under what conditions would you use it?" the officer had asked. Harper had stared at the map for a long moment. "Only if it's the artillery or them overrunning this road and the bridge," he'd said.
And more a physical impact, a pressure that slammed into lungs and eardrums alike. Dirt, stone, and bodies erupted into the air in a single horrifying geyser. The second shell landed just behind the first, perfectly bracketing the densest cluster of men. To the soldiers caught there was no time to react, no cover to dive behind, no ditch to hug.
One instant they were running forward, faces set, rifles raised. The next, the ground they trusted had simply ceased to exist under their feet. From the farmhouse, Harper's men, who dared to risk a glance, would later remember one thing most vividly. It wasn't the shouting that stopped first. It was the movement. In a heartbeat, the entire front of the enemy formation simply froze, not out of discipline, but because there were suddenly fewer people left to move. Behind them, the ranks wavered. Men instinctively slowed, eyes widening as they saw the craters blooming ahead, saw comrades lifted off their feet and thrown in unnatural arcs through the smoke. Some tried to push forward anyway, mindlessly obeying the shouted orders of their officers. Others balked, shoes slipping in mud turned slick with things better not described. The third and fourth shells walked the blast pattern sideways along the road, reaping through attempts to spread out, hammering men who had assumed that if they weren't in the very front, they were safer. From the enemy's point of view, the road itself had betrayed them. They had advanced toward what they thought was a dying line of enemies, and instead stepped into the center of a killing circle drawn in grease pencil hours before by a man now lying on the floor of a ruined house, bleeding from 6 wounds and refusing to let go of consciousness. Inside the village, dust and glass rained from ceilings, walls shuddered, ears bled. Some of Harper's own men would later swear they had been certain they were about to die under their own artillery. But when the last echo finally rolled away and only the ringing remained, they lifted their heads, crawled to their firing slits, and looked out. What had been a charging wave was now a shattered, smoking ruin. Here and there, isolated figures stumbled in shock, weapons dangling from nerveless hands. Some crawled, others stood motionless, eyes unfocused, brains refusing to accept what had just happened to the world in front of them. The officers who were still alive tried to muster them, shouting, waving arms, trying to restore direction to men whose sense of up and down had just been obliterated. They failed. The assault had not just been broken, it had been erased. Behind the village, the last of the Allied trucks rumbled off the far side of the bridge. At 08:47, with confirmation that the column was clear, engineers set off the charges wired to the bridge supports. The blast was smaller than the artillery, but to the men of Company E, it sounded like a door slamming shut. Stone and wood collapsed into the creek below, turning the narrow crossing into a tangle of debris and rushing water. The escape route was gone, for everyone. For the men who had already crossed, it meant survival. For Harper and his company, it meant there would be no pulling back now, no graceful withdrawal. They had done their part. They had held the line until there was no longer a line to hold. When the medics finally reached Harper, collapsed beside the map table, they found him barely conscious, lips pale, uniform soaked through. He had just enough awareness left to ask one question. Did the trucks get through? They told him yes. Only then did he allow his eyes to close. Later, the official report would call it a controlled defensive action with successful use of pre-registered artillery. It would not mention a man doing math with a foggy brain and bloody fingers, timing the last move of his life down to the second. It would not describe the moment when over 100 enemy soldiers who thought they were about to overrun a broken roadblock found themselves frozen in horror as the sky fell exactly on their heads. But the men who were there remembered. They remembered that their sergeant's last clear decision on that road after 6 bullets had tried to silence him was not to save himself, but to make absolutely certain that if someone was going to die on that stretch of French mud, it would not be the exhausted men trying to leave the war behind them.
Harper was finally pulled from the line, unconscious by the time the medics reached him. He would survive the day and the war, but he never again commanded a position quite like that nameless village. The official report called it a successful delaying action. The men who had watched him stagger from post to post under fire called it something else. They called it the day a half-dead sergeant, shot 6 times and barely able to stand, made one last decision that stopped 100 enemy soldiers in their tracks and gave hundreds of his own the chance to live. If stories like this move you, don't let them vanish into footnotes and forgotten reports. Share them, talk about them, and remember that behind every simple line in a history book, there was a real person, bleeding, afraid, exhausted, who still found a way to stand up one more time and change everything in a single, impossible moment.